throughout, see a couple of people slipping out. They're going to make sure the food's ready and all. I don't think I've offended them yet. Usually it takes me a little longer. So if you do see a person or two get up and slip out, they're just going to make sure that everything's ready when we finish. So I hope you will stay and have lunch with us. It's more than just a lunch. It's an opportunity to talk about the future and some really exciting opportunities God has presented us with. If you're a regular attender, I certainly hope you'll be able to be there. But even if you're a guest with us, if you're curious about what the future is going to look like at True Life Church and what the next things are, it's a really great chance for you to come. It's also a great chance for you to have lunch. It's free, and to get to know us if you want to, and to not have to get to know some of us you don't want to. But we'd love to have you stay with us. So I started a series a couple of weeks ago called Livin the Dream. You ever have anybody, you ask them how they're doing, and say they're living the dream? That usually means they're not, right? It's usually said with a little tinge of sarcasm. Oh, but just living a dream, baby. Working 65 hours, in a furnace room. So, but actually, God our Father wants us to have dreams. In fact, I think He gives us dreams. And He also wants us to live them out. If you're a parent, you know this instinctually, that a good father doesn't want to see his children come up short of their dreams. And he doesn't want to see them dream small. So the very first week, I asked a question. Let me read you, first of all, the main text to the series. And it's from Genesis 12, and it's about a man named Abram who might have had one of the most crazy dreams that God gave him, which was a 75-year-old man being told, you're going to have so many descendants that it's going to become a whole nation. And he had 0 at that point. And his wife was 10 years younger than him, but she was well past the age of having a bunch of children too. And so God comes to him and says this. He says, go from your country, your people, and your father's household to the land I will show you. I will make you into a great nation, and I will bless you. Now remember again, Abram's not 21 and just got out of college, and God's going, okay, now I can use you. Abram is wrinkly. He's had to have a few of those little skin cancer places burned off of his face by then. He says, I will make you into a great nation. I will bless you. I will make your name great, and you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and whoever curses you, I will curse. And all the people on earth will be blessed through you. So Abram went as the Lord had told him, and Lot went with him. Abram was 75 years old when he set out from Haran. So Haran was actually a place and it goes on to say he took his wife and his nephew, took some family members. But Haran was a place that they had actually left his original home, which was in a place called Mesopotamia, and it was a town called Ur of the Chaldeans. And he had left it to go to. God had originally given him this call. In fact, if you look, it says the Lord had said, past tense to Abram, to go to this land I'll show you. Well, he had gone about halfway or a little more and taken his dad with him and his bunch of family members when God had said, leave your father's household. He'd kind of taken his dad with him. And he went to Haran, and they settled there, the Bible said, until his father died there. And so the first week I asked the question, how far are you willing to go? Because his father, who God didn't give the dream, was willing to only go about halfway. Now, Ur was this beautiful place. In fact, it was very close to where the original Garden of Eden had been. In the Garden of Eden, it tells us that a river flowed out of it and split into 4, the Tigris, the Euphrates, the Pishon, and there was another, Gihon, I think. And if you look, coming out of the Persian Gulf, right where Ur was, the Tigris goes just to this side, and Euphrates went right under the city, literally. So he came from this fertile place, and they went as far as Haran, which was this cultural, commercial center, and they got very rich there, and Dad was happy there. And it wasn't until Dad passed that Abram then was willing to go. But the first question I said about you is, what dreams has God put in your heart? And basically this was based on 2 things. How far are you willing to go was based on whose dream is it? Because God had spoken to Abram. And it wasn't Abram's dream. It was God that says, I'll make you into a great nation. Abram didn't go, God, do you think you might be willing to make me into a great nation? It was God's dream. So Abram was willing to go only because he knew this was God's dream. God didn't appear to his dad. And so the second week, I asked you a different question, and I asked, how big are you willing to dream? That was last week. And if you haven't downloaded the True Life app, you can find these messages on there. It's simple, just click on them. And this is because Abram then went through 10 years before this next question. He went through 10 years. He went through a famine. He went through a falling away of he and Lot dividing, the family splitting up. He went through fighting a war. He went through all sorts of difficulties, which would make a man go, was that God or was that anchovies on my pizza last night that spoke to me? It would make you ask a lot of questions, and Abram asked a few questions, but God appeared to him again, and this time he said, if you can count the dust in the earth, that's how many descendants you're going to have. So he expanded Abram's dream even more. And then in Genesis 15, where we settled in last week, he said, now come outside and look up at the stars. And if you can count the stars, then you could count your descendants. But he basically expands Abram's dream even bigger. And I guess the question is this. Would God's dreams for you, thinking of yourself again, if you're a parent, thinking of yourself, were your dreams for your children bigger or smaller than theirs? Like, did they go, I'd like to be an astronaut, and you said, well, I think you ought to settle for, secretary's good. Nothing wrong with that. Just simply, did you throttle down their dreams? I'd like to be president. Why don't you just run for, like, county commission? That'd be good for you. That's really about all you need to shoot for. No, we don't talk to our kids like that, and God doesn't to us. God says to Abram, Abram says, could I have a son? And God says, look at the stars, you're going to have that. And so God expands his dream, and the question, I guess, is how big are you? How big am I? How big are we as a church willing to dream? Because it's easy for 10 years of famine and fighting and falling away to steal. I called them dream shrinkers last week. Now, I know I'm rehashing a little bit, but it's very important because this week I've got a third question for you. And the question this week is, how long are you willing to wait? And this goes back to, is it God's dream or your dream? And the first week we talked about that. In fact, the action steps for that week, go home and pray, God, give me your dream for my life. Give me your promise for my life. I don't want to just come up with something. I want what you have for my life. And so how long are you willing to wait? Now, we were in Genesis 15 last week when we stopped, and God had come to him and said, don't be afraid, Abram, I'm your shield, your great reward. And Abram, by then, you begin to hear the words of a man that's tired of waiting and starting to lose heart. God says to Abram, don't be afraid, I'm your shield, your great reward. But Abram said, Sovereign Lord, what can you give me since I remain childless? And the one who will inherit my estate is Eliezer of Damascus. Now, it had been 10 years since Abram came to the promise. 10 years since God said, I'm going to make you into a great nation. And I'm going to give you all the land you see. And for 10 years, all he had seen just about was struggle. Failure on his own part, lying to Pharaoh about his wife being his sister, all of these different things he had gone through. And it was easy for him to start to go, I don't think this is ever going to happen because I'm 85 now. First of all, can I just, for a second, who would want to have a baby at 85 and start raising that dude? But anyway, apparently Abram still did. But he says to God, what can you give me since I remain childless? And he goes on to say, you've given me no children, so a servant in my household will be my heir. Then the word of the Lord came to him. This man will not be your heir, but a son who is your own flesh and blood will be your heir. Then God does two things in response to Abram's questions. First, he reiterates and expands the dream. We talked about that last week. He says, look up at the stars. In other words, you're thinking a son, an heir. I'm thinking galaxy full of sons and daughters. He expands the dream. And he also says, I'm the Lord who brought you out of Ur of the Chaldeans to give you this land to take possession of. So what God actually says, because when he calls him, he says, go to a land I'll show you and I'm going to make you a great nation. But he doesn't say, I'm going to give you the land back then. He doesn't say that till a few years later. And what he really was saying there is, not only am I going to give you this unbelievable dream, but I'm going to give you the resources to fulfill this dream. In other words, a nation needs a place to live. A nation needs food. A nation needs walls to protect themselves. A nation needs space. Abram didn't need a tent. He needed that for a son. But God said, not interested in a son, look at the sky. And so God here says, not only am I going to give you more than you think I'm going to give you, but I'm going to give you the resources to fulfill it. So he says to him, I'm also going to give you the land. Now, Abram at this point, just a little earlier when he fought a war, he had 300 and something fighting men. So 300 men and no son to conquer an entire country and become a great nation would lead to questions, don't you think? And so Abram says this, and he says, Sovereign Lord, how can I know that I will gain possession of it? That's kind of that question. Was that really you, God? Did you really Was I confused? Maybe you didn't promise me this. Maybe this dream didn't come from you. Maybe this is just me. Maybe I just wanted to put myself on a pedestal. Maybe that wasn't God. That's the question. How do I know, God, you're going to really do this? And now here's the thing. And this is where I think this might help you feel a little better about yourself. Because if God were my mom or my dad, I can tell you what the answer to that would have been. There would have been a roar of thunder, and God would have said, because I said so. Right? Because that's what our parents said when they didn't really have a good answer. Because I said so. And really, for God, that's enough, because he doesn't lie. But that's not what he says. And he doesn't get impatient and frustrated and say, you know what, let's just call this thing off. You don't even trust me enough. Look, I just gave you and 300 guys a victory over 5 kings that you fought against, or 4 kings rather, and their armies, and you can't trust me now. We tend to think sometimes we assign God our characteristics, like he's impatient and frustrated if we ask questions. And in fact, I want to take just a second on that, because you might think, you'll hear someone say this, and it sounds really spiritual and right. Man shouldn't question God. Sounds right, doesn't it? Kind of like God will never give you anything you can't bear. That's not in the Bible either. Man shouldn't question God. Well, I want to look at, just for a second, some of the greatest heroes of faith in the entire Bible. Abram says, how do I know how are you going to do this? How do I know you're going to do it? Moses, this great leader of Israel that faced off with Pharaoh, says at one point, Lord, why did you give me these million knuckleheads, stiff-necked, stubborn people to lead? Why don't you just kill me now and take me out of here? David, I counted one time, and it's in the dozens of times in the Psalms that he writes this question, how long, O Lord? How long? I'm past the dozens, let me tell you. But anyway, here's the one guy with perfect faith, Jesus. I think we'd all agree, if you believe Jesus is who he says he is, that his faith was perfect. If we had faith like him, we could move mountains, we could turn grains of mustard seed into trees. Yet Jesus even asked a question. In the garden, he says to his Father, is there any other way? God doesn't get mad when we question. I think we read Job sometimes and we go, well, God gets mad at him. Job asked 10 million questions and God's not mad at him. God's mad at his friends that lied. God actually blesses Job twice as much. And no man in the Bible asks more questions than him. There's about 30 chapters of questions from him. So anyway, Abram says, how can I know? And that's really, I think, the crucial question for how long will you wait is, how can I know you'll really do it? Because if you'll do it, I'll wait. But I don't want to come to the end of life and it never happened. And I spent my whole life waiting, right? Nobody would reasonably want to do that. And here's what God does. He gives Abram a very graphic, powerful response. This is in Genesis 15 still. Verse 9, the Lord said to him, bring me a heifer, a goat, and a ram, each 3 years old, along with a dove and a young pigeon. And he tells Abram, cut all of these in half except the birds, lay one of them on each side. And this was a way of actually making a covenant. They called it cutting a covenant in Old Testament times. And so he says, lay these pieces on each side. And what would happen was the two parties involved, like if I made a covenant with you that I would raise your children if anything happened to you, and you would raise my children if anything happened to me, and we said we're going to seal this with a blood covenant, then the two of us would walk between these animals. And it was called a blood covenant because obviously you put 2 halves of an animal that had been cut in half. There would be blood and things like that. So God says, cut these animals in half and lay them down. And then he has Abram fall asleep. And Abram sees this vision. Verse 17, when the sun had set and darkness had fallen, a smoking firepot with a blazing torch appeared and passed between the pieces. And on that day the Lord made a covenant with Abram and said, to your descendants I will give this land, from the Wadi of Egypt to the great river Euphrates. And he goes on to name all of the people that are living in it now that you're going to push out of it. Now, God mentions 5 animals there. And there's a very significant reason for these 5 animals. And so I'm going to just quickly tell you what each of these animals signify, because there's a ton of other animals. In fact, I'm sure Abram had sheep. I'm quite positive he had camels. But God picks 5 specific animals. First, a heifer. And each of these, if you go back to Exodus and Leviticus, or actually you would go forward to Exodus and Leviticus, you see later God tell Moses what each of these animals represented and what the sacrifice of these animals represented. And the heifer was if a person spilled innocent blood, the sacrifice that they were to take, in each of these cases, they were to bring this animal to the priests at the tabernacle or later at the temple and sacrifice this animal for atonement or forgiveness for what they did. And the heifer was first of all, and the heifer was for shedding innocent blood. In other words, if you killed a person and they didn't do anything to deserve, they didn't attack you, they didn't do anything else, the atonement for that, the forgiveness for that was found in the blood of a heifer. Secondly, he mentioned a goat. And on the Day of Atonement, there were actually 2 goats involved. One of them, they would bring 2 goats to the front of the tabernacle, and the high priest would lay his hands on the head of the first one, and then they would slaughter that goat, and they would use the blood of that goat to make atonement. In fact, that was the only day of the year that the priest went behind the veil into the Holy of Holies. And he took with him the blood of a bull and the blood of a goat. That's different from the Passover. The Passover is a lamb, but before you think, well, he's crazy. On the Day of Atonement, there were 2 goats. The first, they took this goat's blood, and it made atonement for the sins of all the people. There was a second goat, and they laid their hands on its head. They cast lots between these 2 goats, and they laid their hands on this one. And then let me read you what Leviticus 16 says. When he finished purifying the most holy place, he is to present the live male goat. Aaron will lay both his hands on the head of the live goat and confess over it all the Israelites' wrongdoings and rebellious acts, all their sins. He's to put them on the goat's head and send it away into the wilderness by the man appointed for the task. The goat will carry on it all their wrongdoings into a desolate land. In other words, you ever heard the word scapegoat? This was the scapegoat. This is where the term comes from. This goat was charged with all of the people's sins. They were laid the hands on this goat, and the high priests, I guess symbolically, but credited this goat with all the sins of the people, and then they send the goat away, carrying the sins of the people. You probably already see where I'm going with this. The next thing was a ram. And a ram was used slightly differently because a ram was used not for the sins of the people, but to atone and consecrate the actual priests, which now we're told in 1 Peter that we are a kingdom of priests. But at that time, only one of the 12 tribes were actually priests, and they represented the people, so they had to be consecrated and atoned for first. And so this ram was used to consecrate. And then the dove and the pigeon are kind of used interchangeably. And in Leviticus 5, it says, if you cannot afford a lamb, then he shall bring to the Lord as his compensation for the sin that he's committed 2 turtle doves or 2 pigeons, one for a sin offering and the other for a burnt offering. In other words, the poorest of the poor that didn't have a flock, that didn't have a cow, that didn't have a goat, didn't have a ram, didn't have a sheep, God said, anyone can catch a bird. And so what that really said was the poorest, the lowest. And it's kind of interesting, actually, when you look at the dedication of Jesus. Apparently his parents weren't all that wealthy because that's what they brought for his consecration. But what we see here actually, if you pull back from this a couple of thousand years, is a picture of Jesus. So when Abram says, how can I know these things will happen? It's been 10 years since I left everything behind to follow this dream. God showed him a picture of Jesus. Jesus, God's own son, who came to forgive us for shedding innocent blood, his innocent blood, for the sins of the people, also for the sins of the leaders of the people, and even for the poorest, even for the lowest, even for the least. It wasn't just for the rich, it wasn't just for the popular, it wasn't just for the smart, it was for every person. And he, like that goat, that scapegoat, on him, Isaiah said, God has laid the iniquity of us all. And so we see this picture. When Abram says to God, how can I know you'll do it? God shows him that I would go to such lengths for my people. And Romans 8, verse 38, Paul wrote it like this. If God didn't even, I'm paraphrasing just slightly, didn't even hold back his only son, is there any good thing he would hold back from his children? So when we say to God, how do I know this dream you gave me is ever going to come true? God says, look at the cross. Are you asking for more than my only son? Because I already did that for you. And so he says to Abram in this time, here's how you can know I'll do it, because I've already done the most unthinkable, unbelievable, unimaginable, difficult thing that any father could ever do. And that is, I have handed my son over to murderers and said, have it your way. Now there's a second thing that happens here too. When these pieces are cut apart, as I said, the two parties would walk between the animals. Yet there's no mention of Abram doing any walking. Abram is in a trance watching. And there are two things that I said pass between the animals. And it is a fire pot and a torch. Now we're not that familiar with the term fire pot maybe, but a fire pot was literally a furnace. It was used to cook things. It was used to burn things up. It was a big smoldering cauldron of fire. So you could scoop coals out of it and burn things up or whatever. It was actually a fire in a pot. Now, the fire pot is a picture of something. Deuteronomy 4:24, God says, for the Lord your God is a consuming fire. We see a picture of the Father. A fire pot is a picture of the Father. The Father passes through to make this covenant, but there's a second party that passes through, but it's not Abram. The second party is a torch. Now, where a fire pot burned things up was a consuming fire, that's not what you use a torch for. You don't cook with a torch. That would be slow. Unless those little desserts that you set on fire and hope, they bring to your table and you hope they don't set you on fire. But typically, a torch is used for something different, isn't it? It's used for light. It's used to light our path. And Jesus in John 8 says, I am the light of the world. So we see this picture of not God saying, come here, Abram, you and me are going to make this dream work together. Take my hand, we'll walk through. But God saying, sit right there. I, the Father, and the Son. This covenant is going to be performed by us. This isn't a you thing. This isn't a you dream. And this is why it's so important, the question I asked you the first week, whose dream is it? Because if it's God's dream, we need to get out of the dream fulfilling business and get into what did Abram do? When God tells him, I'll do it, it says Abram believed. And God credited it to him for righteousness. The call on Abram is not do it. The call on Abram is not walk through this with me and we'll help each other. We work together, we can do this. The call to Abram is believe. I, the Father, and my son, who will be this scapegoat, who will be this ram, who will be this heifer, who will be this turtle dove and this pigeon. I and my son are going to accomplish this dream for you. You're going to be a great nation, not because of anything you do, because you're already past the age of being able to do this. You're going to be a great nation because of what I and my son are going to do. And today, the dream in your heart, the dream in my heart, the dream in our heart as a group, the dream in your family, the dream of seeing your children one day sitting with you in church that aren't here today, the dream of seeing your parents come to the Lord, the dream of seeing yourself in a position that God has placed in your heart isn't up to you. And this is what Abram was seeing in God, and it's what Abram fouled up. And I can totally identify, because a chapter later, we find good old Abram. A little more time has passed, and Abram and Sarah cook up a plan that we need to help God out a little on this dream thing. Been 10, 11 years already. And so Sarah says, why don't you take my servant as a wife, and she's young enough, you all can have children. And you all have a son, and we'll help God get this nation thing going. He seems to be kind of bogging down in this nation part. And so Abram has learned the lesson of, yes, ma'am, whatever you say, dear. And so he does, and they have a child named Ishmael. Now, 14 more years pass. Ishmael's now a teenager, and God comes back to see Abram. This is in Genesis 17. It says, I am God Almighty. Walk before me faithfully and be blameless. Then I'll make my covenant between me and you and will greatly increase your numbers. Abram's 99 now. I'm going to greatly increase your numbers. And there was no pharmacy to help the man at that point. Then I'll make my covenant between me and you. I'll greatly increase your numbers. Abram fell face down, and God said to him, as for me, this is my covenant with you. You'll be the father of many nations. And here is Abram, the father of the faithful's faith-filled response. Again, this might make you feel a little better. Abram fell face down. He laughed. He said to himself, will a son be born to a man 100 years old? And then he says, but God, I got this other thing. It's called Ishmael. Why don't you just bless him and we'll get that thing going? We're already into the teenage years. Shoot, in 5 more years, he'll be able to drive a camel on his own. He'll get his license, and we're down the road here a little bit. And God says, your wife Sarah will bear you a son. You'll call him Isaac, and I will establish my covenant with him. And a year later, 25 years after God said, I'm going to make you into a great nation, put this dream in Abram's heart that he left home for, he left family members for, he left everything behind, that he fought through a war, a falling out with his family, he fought through famine, he fought through his own personal failures. Finally, 25 years later, God gives him a son. Now, here's the problem with settling for our version of the dream, and this is where you have to be careful, is it's easy to say, well, this is all God meant. This is kind of like what God said, and this must be what he meant. Maybe I just kind of misunderstood him. And we settle. The problem is that thing we settle for will always be in competition with that thing God put in our heart. First, it starts that Hagar, Sarah's slave, begins to, she and Sarah build up this resentment because she can have a baby and Sarah won't. And Sarah has Abram send her away. But she eventually comes back, and then when Isaac is just a young man, he and Ishmael have an issue. Ishmael's making fun of him and poking fun at him. He's a lot older than him. It's big brother, little brother stuff. And Sarah says, no, send him away. And the son of the slave, Paul says, will always be at war with the son of the Spirit. And if in your life and mine we decide this must be what God meant, we'll settle for that, we will raise the son of the slave. And when God does, because God didn't get mad at Abram again and go, well, we're not going to do that anymore. You just raise that own, that little punk on your own, and we'll. No, God still fulfills the dream. And the problem is now Abram has 2 dreams, the slave and the spirit, the free. And he eventually has to go through this painful separation from his own flesh and blood because he's raised a dream. He has settled for a dream. He has made something that God never said, the dream. It looked enough like it. He's accepted it as the answer to his dream. And so we find Abram 25 years later with Isaac as a baby, and we find him having to deal with the aftermath of his plan. Now, I want to close with this scripture. And it's in Romans 4. And I want to close with it because I think it speaks to you and I, because there are many of us here, and probably all of us at some point in our life have experienced what it is like to think God has put something in my heart and it's just not happening. And yet, I know this wasn't me. I know I didn't dream this up. This is not even what I really would have chosen. And yet, I know God put it there, and yet 5 years, 10 years, 15 years have passed. 20 years, 25 years have passed. And at some point in there, it's quite easy to either give up or to raise a version of it that's close enough that we can generate. Romans 4 verse 18 says, against all hope, Abraham in hope believed, and so became the father of many nations, just as it had been said to him, so shall your offspring be. Remember, God said, look at the stars, so shall your offspring be. Without weakening in his faith, he faced the fact that his body was as good as dead since he was about 100 years old, and that Sarah's womb was also dead. It's a real easy time to give up on your dream when your body's dead and the mother's womb is dead. Yet he did not waver through unbelief regarding the promise of God, but was strengthened in his faith. I keep wanting it to be in his face. Was strengthened in his faith and gave glory to God, being fully persuaded. This is what I want me to hear and you to hear. Being fully persuaded that God had power to do what he had promised. And this is why it was credited to him as righteousness. So when the wait seems long and I begin to question God and ask, can I be sure you're going to fulfill this? How do I know you're ever going to do this? How do I know this was you? He says, look at the cross. Look at my son. Look what I already did for you. Is the ask you've got bigger than what I've already done? And the answer, resoundingly, I don't know what your dream is. It doesn't matter. The answer is no. There is no father here that there's any other request he would less prefer than give your only child up. And so God says, just as he did to Abram, let me show you how you can know you can trust me. Let me show you what I am going to do. And in our case, what I've already done. And when I begin to want to help God and ask, what can I do to make it happen? God, could you just use this mess I've made and turn it into the dream? God says, believe. Just believe. If I gave you the dream, it's on the fire pot and the torch to fulfill it. It's on the Father and the Son to fulfill it. All it says Abram did is, he says to Abram this, I'm your shield, walk in righteousness and integrity. And Abram believed. And he would say to you that you keep looking at your watch and going, when is this dream ever going to happen? And it's gone from a watch to a calendar. And you're saying, when, God? How long, God? And he's saying, walk in righteousness and integrity and just believe. You didn't hatch the dream, and it's not up to you to fulfill the dream. And God will. How do I know he will? Because if he gave his only son, will he hold back any good thing? Let's bow our heads. Lord, I believe I'm in a room full of dreamers. I believe you've placed dreams in many of our hearts, and some of them maybe look attainable right now, but some of them may look like they're as far away as those stars that you told Abram to look at. Yet, Lord, there is no ask too big for you. There is no dream bigger than yours. There is no one that you don't love and that you didn't make provision for in your son. From the poorest to the priests to all of the people of the nation to even the ones that the unknowing, innocent sins. You made provision for everyone. You love everyone. You are no respecter of person. There is not one dream you've placed in anyone's heart here that you will allow to go unfulfilled. Give us faith, Lord, to just believe. Take the pressure off of ourselves to produce it and just believe. Let's stand. We're going to do one last song. I'm going to